It is wonderful to see you all here. We've all seen this 8th iteration of the Monterey Summer Symposium on Russian Studies through its gestation, and it is now fantastic to get the ball rolling and to see the momentum pick up. I hope that you're all excited for what will be an immersive, thrilling, and perhaps even transformative experience. Without further ado, I will introduce Professor Ronald Suny, emeritus distinguished professor at the University of Michigan, the author of innumerable works, including Red Flag Unfurled, The Baku Commune, Stalin, The Passage to Revolution, and he's still writing and will soon be publishing a book on the forging of nations. He gave the inaugural address last year, and he was so good at it that we decided to invite him back again to do it again. And this lecture will be on empires, nations, Russia, the Soviet Union, and the making of nations in the South Caucasus. So, Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Willem. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. But before we start, I want to thank the person who made all of this possible, Anna Borisovna Vasilieva, and we maybe should greet her and thank her.
Thank you.
If you only knew how much work, discussion, planning, frustrations, joys goes into planning it, you realize why this is such a successful enterprise. So I'm going to talk today about some concepts which you may be familiar with, and you'll forgive me if this is too elementary, but I think we should all start on basically the same ground. So I'm going to try to give some definitions and explain what I'm talking about, and it'll flow through the lectures, and perhaps others will also pick up, other speakers will pick up on that, or maybe not. Now, many of you probably know that there was a big shift in scholarly understanding of nations and nationalism roughly at the beginning of the 1980s. And the year 1983, you can almost mark that as the date at which major works were published. And that was the year that Eric Hobsbawm published and Terence Ranger, The Invention of Traditions. That's the year that Ernst Gellner wrote his book on nations and nationalism. And most importantly, of course, now you know what I'm going to say, that was the year that Benedict Anderson published Imagined Communities, his reflections on nationalism. And from that moment on, there was a kind of bifurcation between popular, journalistic, governmental even, understandings of what nations were, where they came from, how we should understand them, and the scholarly community. And there was a struggle over trying to work out this new way of understanding. And I was very happy as, at that time, being a young scholar in my 40s. I think of that as young. I'm now older than Joe Biden. So which is not that old, of course, not for Democrats anyway. So I decided that I would fight the good fight. And it turned out, I was even invited at that time, I don't know why they did it, to places like the CIA, the Defense Department, the Foreign Institute for diplomats to talk about these new ways of understanding nations, right? Because about that time, the Soviet Union, which is one of the major focuses of our symposium, began to disintegrate. And no one knew anything about non-Russian peoples. They were all concentrating on Moscow and Leningrad. On the top, political scientists were all trying to guess who was standing next to whom on the mausoleum. And so the periphery of this empire was largely left out, except there were a bunch of, distinguished, I think, and now I appreciate even more, scholars, usually emigres, who indulged in what you might call nostalgia and nationalism, but did provide some answers to the questions of who these people were. And at the time, there were these two major ways, you can add others probably, of understanding ethnicity or the nation. One we call primordialism, and the other we call constructivism, or some people would call modernism. So let me just briefly define what we mean by primordialism, or what Ernst Gellner and I later called the Sleeping Beauty view of nationalism. And that view was something like this, and I'll simplify, but basically, the nation is a product of nature. It's a natural thing, it's always with us, it emerges in the fullness of time. It's related somehow to kinship and ethnicity, to human nature. It's a kind of grand family. It's a natural association of human beings. And therefore, the language of this ancient and continuous and organic concept of nation always talked about recovering the nation, rebirth of the nation, renaissance, zartonk in Armenian. We have many different terms that you can apply. This primordial view of the continuity, naturalness of nations is, of course, the view of nationalists and is embedded in what I will define a little later in what I call, and I'm writing a book about this, the discourse of the nation that congealed finally in the 19th century, as it has become ever since the major way in which we look and conceive of nations. Opposed to that view is the view of modernists or constructivists. Now, as you probably know, given your generation, everything is now constructed, right? Everything's constructed. And if it's something as natural as gender can be constructed, then of course class and nationality, nation, ethnicity also is up for grabs. Now this view, instead of the Sleeping Beauty view of nationalism, I'm going to call, and this was given to me by my friend Reginald Zelnick years ago, the Bride of Frankenstein view of nationalism. And if you think of Eric Hobsbawm's famous phrase, this explains what this view is. In other words, for Hobsbawm and constructivists, nationalism comes before nations. Nations do not make states and nationalisms, but the other way around. So rather than organically emerging from below, this natural concept of nation, and then people thinking about it called nationalism, it's actually the discourses and imaginary of the way people can organize themselves that then helps create discursively and also materially in many ways what a nation is. So in this view then, the nation is modern. It's a product not of nature but human activity. It arose first in the 17th and 18th century, but came into full force in the 19th century and became overwhelmingly dominant, particularly after World War I, in the 20th century. So the language associated with constructivism or modernism is not about recovery of something that was always there, but of creating, imagining, or even inventing the nation. So that view, which has now become hegemonic and dominant, though by the way, there's a kind of neo-primordial attack, because this is a very dangerous view. Years ago, 1997, I came to Armenia and I gave a lecture on how Armenia, which was then embattled in a war with Azerbaijan, on how Armenia means we are an imagined community. I had to be taken from that hall by the police and protected because I had undermined this sacred view that we are an ancient, primordial nation with a continuous history that justifies, of course, our claim to this little piece of territory, and by the way, some territories still in Turkey and Azerbaijan, and I was undermining that claim, and people were dying and killing precisely for this primordial sense of the nation. Now, in my work, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later when I discuss the discourse of the nation, but in my work, this idea of forging of the nation, I actually start, it'll sound like I'm doing primordialism, with the Old Testament. Because there are traditions and tropes and understandings of political community that appeared in ancient Israel that then became continuous and ready and available for borrowing throughout centuries. Ideas of the promised land, of a covenant. Well, that was a covenant with God, not a very equal covenant, obviously he had the better hand, but still there were such notions of promised land, and so forth and so on. And in some odd way, consent of the people. But in the book, I try to emphasize how different various conceptions through time, as much as there's borrowings over time, there are with modern conceptions of the nation, which only could exist once a discourse of the nation actually had emerged and consolidated late in the 18th century and early in the 19th century. In the book, I talk about several concepts or several big subjects like the state, the nation, empire, and capitalism, of course, as things that help form what today is considered the modern nation state, the nature of our society, and so forth. So I would begin with the state, because the state, chronologically, was the first consolidation of this political form, probably in the period of absolutism, so 16th, 17th century, which, though contested by aristocracies and ordinary people, that the state, as it was emerging in that period, established a set of political institutions that, this will be familiar to some of you, tell me who I'm quoting here, political institutions over a given territory that more or less monopolized the legal use of violence. Weber, yeah, Max Weber. A+. Okay, so that was Weber's idea, and it was then elaborated on by people like Anthony Giddens and my own colleague Charles Tilly and so forth. So what is the state then? Quoting again Weber, a compulsory political organization whose administration successfully upholds the claim to the monopoly of legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. I add to that, how bold of this young scholar, right? I was young then. I add to that the words, not only the monopoly of legitimate violence over a given territory, but delivers a range of goods and services to the population. And this state, once it's achieved, is characteristic of rational modernity. All right, I won't belabor these points. There's a wonderful histories, kind of macro histories of how the state emerged. For instance, Charles Tilly, a historical sociologist, said this, and this is quoted over and over and over again. The state makes war, and war makes the state. Right? So if you think of Peter the Great or something like that, that is, once you go to war, you then need taxes. In order to collect taxes, you need a bureaucracy or institution. So these things function together. Now that militaristic, or sometimes called Bielistic idea of how the state is formed has also been contested by others. But very importantly, the state then is part of that idea. Okay, and along with the state comes, in the early modern period, so we're talking 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, something that Foucault or Elias or Philip Gorski and others call the disciplinary revolution, that they're not only the infrastructure and the institutions, but the state also begins to extend its powers into society, disciplining people, right? Deciding things like when taverns can be open or closed, what you can and can't do on a Sunday, right? So now we're talking about the state getting pretty modern as it extends its tentacles into society as well and creating, a kind of official morality or whatever. Now, one of the most contested terms is the second big concept or association that I talk about, and that's the nation. The problem with nation, of course, is it's a term that's used in all kinds of different ways. It's often conflated with state. So the United Nations is actually about a union of states, right? Different states, some of whom could have been empires or city-states or whatever. But nation, I define not in that particular way, but with a very specific definition. No one has to accept this definition, but it's one that conforms to the modern understanding of nation, not the way nation has been used historically through the ages. So lots of words like azg in Armenian will be defined as nation, but used in the 8th century, right? Because they had to talk somehow about the association of all these Armenians or whatever. So here's how I define nation. In any definition, always look at the first noun after the is. That'll give you a clue as to what's coming up. A nation is a group of people, not institutions like the state. It's a group of people who imagines itself to be a political community distinct from the rest of humankind, that by virtue of its shared culture, put culture in quotes, deserves self-determination. So a group of people distinct from the rest of humankind that by virtue of its shared culture deserves self-determination, which usually entails self-rule, control of its own territory, which it will call the homeland, Hayrenik, Rodina, Heimat, whatever, Sham Troblo in Georgian, and will control its own territory, the homeland, and perhaps a state of its own. Now notice what this modern idea of nation, modern sense of nation is doing. It is connecting culture and politics. Ethnic culture, linguistic culture, but in the United States we don't share ethnic culture, we share political culture, right? Americans are those who have pledged to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so forth, not, to baseball or pizza, which are American institutions, right? We borrowed everything. Okay, so the culture endows the people with the right of self-determination. Now that's very different from the way earlier societies organized themselves. Political unity or political right to rule came from God, from the guy with the biggest stick, some conqueror, usually an emperor or whatever, to a certain tribe perhaps, who subordinated others, whatever. But instead of political power and sovereignty coming down from above, in the modern nation, it ideally comes from below, right? Note that all these concepts that I'm telling you, both state, nation, and I'm going to get to empire in a moment, are ideal types in the Weberian sense, right? They are things that we use for heuristic purposes. I love that word, heuristic. You always define that for undergraduates, but I don't have to do that for you. It means teaching. They're tools to understand things. They don't necessarily, and usually don't, actually exist in reality in that particular way. But they should be helpful in our understanding of something. And they should, if they're good definitions, and I think mine are terrific, they should explain things. In other words, they shouldn't just describe something, they should actually have explanatory power. I learned that from the 11 years I was at the University of Chicago in a department of political science. Political scientists are careful about defining things. Do we have any political scientists here? Oh, good, we got one of them. Yeah, they usually define things. Historians, who cares, We use the words, they go all over the place, and hopefully you understand the same thing that the author does. But they at least try to be more precise and rigid, rigorous, did I say rigid? With the way they define things. Okay, so that's what a nation is. Now the word nationalism, which came up, probably invented by a German philosopher, Johann Gottlieb von Herder, at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, is a kind of sentiment, a kind of, he called it the sentiment de nationalité. It's a sentiment or doctrine that expresses primary or ultimate loyalty to and affection for a particular nation and dedication to its promotion and advancement. That's a broad definition, and eventually in the book I break that down. I try not to use the word nationalism too much. Why? Because it's used to explain everything. In fact, many people, scholars, will just say, oh, that's nationalism, and that's sufficient as an explanation. Not asking the question, why nationalism? Or why this particular form? Fascism is a virulent form of nationalism. That's very different from loving Mussorgsky's operas, which people all say, oh, that's also nationalism. That's why Russians love those operas or something like that. We like an opera called Anush, which unfortunately is not playing in the city right now, right? But so it seems to me it's too broad. It tries to explain too much. And what you want to explain is why this particular sentiment, this is actually working here. So one of the most useful or limited definitions of nationalism is the one found in Gellner's very first line in his little book on nations and adopted by Hobsbawm. I'll quote that. Nationalism, says Gellner, is primarily a political principle which holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent. I think by national he means sort of ethnic, linguistic, cultural, right? Nationalism as a sentiment or as a movement can best be defined in terms of this principle. Nationalist sentiment is the feeling of anger aroused by the violation of this principle, or the feeling of satisfaction aroused by its fulfillment. A nationalist movement is one actuated by a sentiment of this kind, unquote. Now notice, it's about sentiments. Sentiments are feelings, they are emotions. Nationalism is an affective phenomenon, and we'll talk about that as we go forward in the lectures. Very importantly, nationalism, embodied in what I'm going to call the discourse of the nation, is a theory of political legitimacy. And nationalists will want the ethnic or cultural boundaries to be equivalent to, congruent with, the political ones. And in particular, the ethnic boundaries within a given state, that we all live in together. Now, if you think of that principle of the nation, that somehow in the diversity of languages and cultures in the world and the movements of people, that we should achieve some kind of congruence of culture and the political boundaries and ethnicities, you are more utopian than Marxists. This is a principle that has led to ethnic cleansing, and we're watching it going on right now on your television, and genocide, which also you're watching on your television. So it's a very dangerous principle, but it's built into nationalism. And that will be, once these nations and nation states are established and become the norm, particularly after World War I, it will lead to war and mass killing. It will be part of the equation that made this 20th century, and apparently we're moving in the same direction in this century, it will lead to more violence. Now, I'm going to define one more term before I get to empire, because I use it in a particular way, and that's patriotism. So we've talked about nationalism. Patriotism, I use in two different ways. Sometimes you could say nationalism is my country, right or wrong. Chauvinism, kind of, right? National chauvinism. My country, right or wrong. Patriotism would be something, and this is actually in the philosophical literature from ancient Greece on. There's a wonderful book by a guy named Maurizio Viroli, who taught or maybe teaches still at Princeton, on patriotism. A patriot is one who says, my country, when it's right. And when it's not, I work to make it right. So virtue is very important in, and Machiavelli, for instance, was someone who had this idea of patriotism. So that's one way you can use patriotism. I haven't quite worked out in the book how to use that sense, and the other way I've been using it, that patriotism is loyalty to the state rather than to the nation, the group of people. So when people say Russia in 1812 was nationalist, which I think is wrong, I say there were Russians, particularly aristocrats, upper class people, the dynasty, who were patriotic. They were loyal to the Tsar. Not to the Narod, that was going to come later, but to the Tsar. So that's another sense of patriotism, is loyalty to the ruling group, state, dynasty, whatever. So I haven't quite worked out how to put those two together. Maybe you'll help me do that. Mark Twain put it this way, patriotism, I like this. Mark Twain said, patriotism is supporting your country all the time and your government when it deserves it. So you can see there are various ways that you could use this term. So finally, this other contentious term, how are we doing time? Empire. And we're going to be talking about empires. Empires up to the second half of the 20th century were the most ubiquitous and long-lived political units in history, all over the world. We now are opposed to empires, but they in fact governed more people more of the time than any other political form. Tsarist Russia, which is our concern, was in its own self-definition unquestionably an empire and was proud to call itself an empire. Tsarstva or imperia. The Soviet Union rejected such a characterization as empire. It was anti-imperial, but that was a term only applied to it by its enemies, like evil empire from Ronald Reagan. And the question of whether the USSR should be considered an empire remains controversial. In a book that Val Kivelson and I wrote, which is a wonderful book you should all read, and it's not expensive, called Russia's Empires, we consider the Soviet Union a particular and peculiar form of empire. And you'll see whether you agree with that term or not. So what is an empire? An empire, like a nation state, which is a state that conforms with the nation, empire, like nation state, is best understood, first of all, as a historically constructed form of governance, of state. And it contains both objective and subjective elements. So here's what I will consider empire, and I will oppose empire as an ideal type to the nation state. So now I'm not talking about nation, but nation state. When the nation and the state are one, nation state and empire. And I'm going to show, I think, how they're different. And I've borrowed these definitions from people like John Armstrong and Michael W. Doyle, two political scientists. I consider empire to be a particular form of domination or control between two units set apart in a hierarchical, inequitable relationship. More precisely, a composite state in which a metropole, a center, dominates a periphery to the disadvantage of the periphery. Now that's complicated and too formal, so I'm going to explain what I'm talking about. The key characteristic of an empire as a state or a form of domination is twofold. One, empires are inequitable rulerships. One legally distinctive group rules another and believes it has the right to dominate that other group. Think of the British in India, right? The domain of the empire is a people subject to unequal rule. So there are two things involved here. One is domination of one group over another, or institution over another, right? In the Ottoman Empire, it's a ruling institution, you know, the askeri and others, over the raya and so forth. But, and in Russia, it's the dynasts and the aristocrats, it's over the narod, etc. But notice, the two groups have to be distinguished in some way. So there's definition of distinction, that's very important, of difference, definition of difference, and legitimacy of hierarchy. Now, if that's true of inequality and subordination in empire, in the nation state, in the ideal form of the nation state, in the ideal model, it's not difference and inequality, it's homogeneity and equality. So in the ideal type of the nation state, we're not subjects, we're citizens. We're all equal, at least under the law. Now we know Look at any country in the world, except Armenia, of course, but any country in the world, and there'll be inequalities of all kinds. I was joking, of course, about Armenia, but in the United States, for instance, even there. But this idea that we're all the same, at least under the law, we're equal, and we're all Americans. And that's an ideological basis on the legitimation, for the legitimation of that particular polity, right? That's very different from empires, very different from empires. Because empires are about one group superior to another group that believes it has the right to rule over that other group. Now, if that's true, then that group will have to maintain its distinctiveness, the ruling group, and difference from everybody else. So here we come toward an explanation, right? How do you justify the superiority of those people over the inferior? And there'll be a variety of ways. In earlier centuries, why bother? We just knock you on the head and we rule over you. And we're there, and it's mostly about coercion. In modern times, every state, this is political science 101, every state tries to move from coercion to cultural hegemony, so that you believe that we ought to obey this ruler because they have the right to rule you. So you don't have to have a policeman on every corner or a knight on horseback in every village. People accept that you have the right to rule. So how was that achieved in modern times? In a variety of ways, right? So God put me on the throne, obey God, and you have your own ideological apparatus, the clergy and the church, to help you keep that all working nicely. Or, you have a mission, a mission civilisatrice, a civilizing mission. And so many 19th and 20th century empires justified their legitimacy by saying, we are going to turn you from barbarians, we won't call you that, you savages. We will turn you from barbarians into civilized modern people, right? Now, I have a concept which I call the dilemma of empire. What if you actually civilize the people? What if the British in India actually create a class of lawyers and civil servants who know English and have ambitions of their own, Mahatma Gandhis and Nehrus, etc.? Who needs the British after a while? In other words, the dilemma of empire is, as you succeed as a civilizing force, you actually undermine the principle of legitimacy for keeping the superior people in power. Think of the Soviet Union. The major framing of the Soviet Union is of a failed state. I propose to you that the Soviet Union succeeded only too well. It was an empire, ruled by a superior group, the nomenklatura, the highest levels of the party, which did what in its 70 years of power? It educated the people. Tsarist empire didn't educate the people. Right? A lot of empires like to keep people stupid because they become threats. Soviet Union, had almost 100% people. It took a society 80% peasant and turned it into a society 80% urban. There was upward mobility. Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick is one of the first that began to talk about this upward mobility. It created engineers and scholars and teachers and institutions and people who no longer needed the paternalistic, repressive party state. And ultimately, when Gorbachev weakened the state sufficiently, people made a move to get rid of the empire. In other words, the Soviet Union succeeded only too well in producing its negation, a good Marxist concept there, right? And undermined the nature of that particular empire. So we'll see whether that works for you or whether it doesn't work for you. So that's my dialectic of empire. You won't be surprised that some empires are modernizing empires, and empires in the 19th to 20th century were not ready to give up and disappear. Even in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, the empires were still being enforced. The British and people like Churchill were not going to give up that empire. They fought hard against it at the end of World War II. But something had changed after the World War II. Britain was flat on its back. France was weak. The Dutch Empire had been occupied, etc. And the two emerging great powers were anti-imperialist, the United States and the Soviet Union, in their own concept. And they helped move the world toward decolonization by the 1960s. Okay, one other thing before I turn to the Caucasus. Do I have a little time yet? Or? Okay. This, I mentioned several times what I call the discourse of the nation. You might think of this cluster of ideas that I'm going to talk about, the discourse of the nation, as nationalism. But this discourse of the nation is what is behind nationalism. It's the cluster of ideas that came out of all of those centuries and came together at the end of the 18th century that became a powerful way of understanding politics, the world, history, etc. And these things then became part of what nationalists, some governments, believed was true. And this is how people thought about the nation, and to some great degree, still think about the nation. Things like, I won't go through all of them, but the conviction that humanity is naturally divided into separate and distinct nationalities and nations, that we're really different from one another, and homogeneously different. That is, Armenians really are not Georgians, and Georgians are not Azerbaijanis, and we are very different. And nationalists will always try to homogenize those nationalities and make them more like one another and as distinct as possible from the next. The Soviet Empire tried to make Kyrgyz and Kazakhs as distinct as possible from one another, even though before they had been quite, in fact, even the names were mixed up, so that, Kyrgyz were called, I think, Kazakh, I don't remember the whole thing, but probably you remember all of these things. And they made them as distinct as possible. Now they're different nation states that might fight over their borders or whatever. In this discourse of the nation, it's understood that the nation is natural, not historical. These things are in the real world, but you have to watch out. They may also disappear. So you have to fight for your nation. You have to help preserve it. You have to teach your children the language at times. This discourse of the nation sees nations as primordial. I wrote an essay called Constructing Primordialism and tried to explain, I can talk about that some other time. Why do nations imagine they're primordial? Why is it easier to think that and dangerous to think that they're constructed, which would be more contested if it were so. So nations also have the potential to die if they're not guarded and nourished. And one of the fears of nations, you see this in fascism, is that if we don't fight and preserve ourselves and even build an empire, we will decline and disappear. You find that very powerfully. The idea in the discourse of the nation is that the identity of the nation is a relatively fixed essence shared by members of the nation. It might come from biology, it might come from culture, might come from subscription to certain political principles, but it's indelible. And it's clear that differences with other nations is far greater than any internal differences, class or gender or locality within the nation. And so there's a history implied in the discourse of a nation, that nations have been suppressed, their real essence is kept down, but in time they will rise. It's inevitable they will rise. They will overthrow empires. That's natural and given. If you read Richard Pipes' famous book on Soviet nationalities, it's implied. So the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union are unnatural states, empires, even though they're the most long-lived polities in history, and nations are inevitably going to rise. And so these are some of the things, and very importantly is the principle that a nation possesses the right to self-rule, which has been repressed in the past and should legitimately be given to it, and it has a right to a territory of its own. And that creates all kinds of problems. In the discourse of the nation, which is now dominating the world, the only legitimate governments are ones that represent the nation. And that might be achieved through elections, democratically, but not necessarily. And the nation discourse demands that the people in power be like the people of the nation, not this difference from, as in dynasties, often they're usually Germans and relatives of Queen Victoria or something like that. But no, they should be like the people as well. So that's a very powerful concept that now, and by the way, I think implied in the discourse of the nation, though very often not fulfilled, is an impulse toward democracy. Because it's the people that's the nation, and they ought to be represented. And yet, obviously, in real time, in real places, it hardly exists. So nations in the modern sense exist and can only exist once this discourse of the nation becomes consolidated and widely accepted. Now, if you go back to, let's say, I'll give you one example, early in the 19th century, which I've written about in the book that you can't get yet, but there was a contest over this nation. So nation had become a powerful word by the early 19th century from the French Revolution, la nation, right? But it was contested. So kings said, we're the nation, I'm the nation. Aristocracies in Poland and Hungary said, no, we're the nation, not the. And then people like Mazzini and Marx and others said, no, the people are the nation. So they were, and eventually it would be the people. But it took time for that concept to solidify around that. All right. So that brings us then finally to, and I'll just take a minute to do this because we can talk about this again in the next session, the making of nations in the Caucasus. And here's what I would say about this, just very broadly. One, don't juxtapose nations necessarily, empires to making of nations in the sense that empires are always repressive of nations. Empires like the Tsarist Empire, and very much in a fulfilled way in the Soviet Empire, made nations. They made it in a variety of ways. They encouraged various upper classes and middle classes to learn about their own culture. If you think about the Tsarist Empire, archaeology, krayovedenia, academies where you'd study the culture. Georgians went to Petersburg to learn about Georgia. You couldn't learn it in Tbilisi, right? Armenians went to Dorpat, now Tartu, or to Europe to learn about Armenians. So there were ways in which the empires promoted the learning about their own nations and allowed it to happen, even though they also helped create nations by repressing them and by also then generating opposition to those repressions. A very important point, I think, which is misunderstood or understood in the literature, is that by the end of the Tsarist Empire, by World War I, nationalism was largely a phenomenon of the middle class, of intellectuals, not of broad swaths of the people. Nationalism there's a wonderful Czech Marxist historian named Miroslav Hroch. I don't know if anybody has read Hroch, but he has a wonderful book on small nations. And he has different stages, where first only a few clerics and patriots and scholars are writing about the nation, stage one, stage A or something. Then it spreads in the second stage toward newspapers and teachers and schools. And then in the third stage, it reaches the peasantry and you have nationalist movements and so on. Well, much of that had not yet happened in the Tsarist Empire. In Poland, it was true. In Finland, actually among Armenians, to some extent among Georgians, not among the Muslim peoples particularly, before the revolution. But it was beginning to develop. There was an explosion of the spread of nationalism during World War I, because different powers were fostering nationalisms against the enemy state. So Germans would foster Ukrainian nationalism against Russia, right? And Russians would do the same with other nationalisms. Then you had a brief period of revolution and independence. The Tsarist Empire had collapsed. The Bolsheviks had not yet consolidated their rule through the Civil War. So roughly from 1918 to 1921, you have these independent states in the Caucasus and elsewhere. In the Caucasus, you have 3 independent states formed in late May 1918, and they last until the Red Army comes. The Red Army comes first to Baku in April 1920. The end of 1920, it comes to Armenia and saves Armenia from the Kemalist nationalists coming in the other direction. And then they go into Georgia and they overthrow in Georgia a socialist government, the Menshevik government of Georgia, which could perfectly well have ruled Georgia on its own as a socialist state. It wasn't a socialist state, but it had socialist government ruling over a bourgeois democratic state. Even Lenin recognized that state as legitimate, and then Stalin and Orjonikidze, two Georgians, said no, and they invaded. And Lenin, being a pragmatist, said, "Oh, that's okay. Okay, we got it. Soviet Georgia is ours, right?" But the biggest thing, and we'll talk about this afternoon or in the next session, was the Soviet experience, which is one of the most bizarre and amazing experiments in making nations in human history. They literally decided they're going to make nations, even though they were against nationalism, in this huge state, that covers 2 continents.